Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of the 12th International Disability Summer School, organized by the Centre for Disability Law and Policy of the National University of Ireland, Galway. My name is Delia Ferri, and I'm a professor of law at Maynooth University in Ireland. I have also the pleasure to co-direct the Assisted Living and Learning Institute, in short, ALL Institute, at Maynooth. My academic research focuses on the rights of persons with disabilities, and in particular, my current research focuses on the right of persons with disabilities to participate in cultural life. This is a research project funded by the European Research Council. For this reason, I'm particularly delighted to have the honor to chair this panel today, which includes very distinguished speakers. Before asking each speaker to introduce themselves, I would like to give a brief audio description of myself. This was an accessibility measure introduced by the organizers of the summer school. Well, I have brown hair and brown eyes, and today I'm wearing glasses, a black jacket, and a white shirt. It's now my pleasure to hand over to our three distinguished speakers, Mr. Monthian Buntan, Dr. Janet Lord, and Miss Amy Farkas, who are internationally recognized experts on disability rights. Each speaker in turn will introduce and audio describe themselves. The floor is yours. Let's start from Monthian.
A very good afternoon to all of you from Bangkok, Thailand. My name is Monthian Buntan, and I'm currently serving as member of the Senate, Royal Thai Parliament. I also just completed my second term as member of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I have extensive working experience in the civil society sector. I'm currently a board member of Thailand Association of the Blind, also Disabilities Thailand, and also holding a honorary life member of the World Blind Union. It's a very great honor to be invited to participate in this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you so much, Delia. My name is Janet Lord, and I am currently a senior fellow with the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. I had the incredible honor of a lifetime to be able to participate in the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in New York, serving in the last part of the process on the legal team of Disabled Peoples International, so primarily on the civil society side of things. I have a great passion for disability sport and have written on that topic, as well as the topic of the right to participate in cultural life. And I am also currently serving as a senior advisor for the newly appointed Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Gerard Quinn. So it's just a great pleasure and honor to be with you all today. I am coming here from Baltimore, Maryland. And this morning I am wearing an Irish sweater appropriately. It's rather cold here in Baltimore. I have blonde hair, short hair, and I'm wearing this morning round greenish glasses and also earrings. And I'm appearing in front of at my desk on the third floor of my house and in front of a bookcase. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amy.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be with all of you. I'm Amy Farkas. I am sitting in my home office with a bookcase behind me. I have dark brown long hair. I'm wearing brown glasses, a green blouse, And I am currently working as a consultant in international and inclusive development. And I've worked for about 20 years in this sector for UN agencies, for civil society, for academia and research institutions. And I'm very interested in the elements related to sport, recreation, leisure, and physical activity. And I was also fortunate to be involved with the drafting to some degree on behalf of the International Paralympic Committee at the time. So I'm very pleased to be with you today.
Thank you very much to all our distinguished speakers for their lovely introduction and audio description.
So, well, sorry, I have not described myself with audio description, but can I interrupt maybe for less than a minute?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, being a blind myself, sorry, I'm sitting at my house being semi-locked down now under the current situation in Thailand. And I've been blind by birth, since birth, and I'm with black hair, of course, no eyeglasses, and I'm sitting with a piano behind me, but you may not see it because I have set the scene to be more or less an ocean scene on the background. I'm sitting in front of my notebook computer, wearing a navy blue shirt, a polo shirt. It's quite hot here, over 33 degrees Celsius. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this lovely audio description, and thank you all our distinguished speakers for their fantastic introduction. This year, as you know, the summer school focuses on disability and culture, and our panel discussion is entitled "The Right to Participate in Cultural Life, Recreation, Leisure and Sport." Well, it's worth recalling that the right to participate in cultural life is deeply rooted in international human rights law. Article 27 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights states that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share the scientific development, advancement, and its benefits. In the same vein, Article 15, paragraph 1, letter A of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights recognizes the right of everyone to take part in cultural lives. Well, those international treaties are extremely important. However, while they protect the right to everyone to take part in cultural life, they don't focus on the needs of persons with disabilities. And Article 30 in this respect fills a gap because it redesigns and rewrites the right to participate in cultural life, taking into account the diversity of persons with disabilities. Article 30, as we will hear in this panel, obliges state parties to ensure accessibility of cultural materials and services, as well as accessibility of cultural heritage, but also requires state parties to take all appropriate measures to enable persons with disabilities to have the opportunity to develop and utilize their creative, artistic, and intellectual potential. Our panel discussion today will focus on the negotiation of Article 30 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, focusing on culture, which I have just mentioned, but also on the other components, sports and leisure, that are also protected and promoted in this article. The panel will be organized as follows. There will be 4 questions that I will be so glad to pose to our speakers, and our speakers will have approximately 5 minutes for their answers. Without further ado, I would like to start with the first question that is in particular addressed to Janet and Monthian. So, Janet and Monthian, can you talk a bit about drafting of the CRPD in general, and to set a bit the scene, who participated into the drafting work, how it worked, why was it different from other treaty drafting processes? Janet, if you want to start.
Thank you so much. Everyone hear me okay? All right, excellent. That's a wonderful question. And, you know, you really set the scene for why we needed the treaty in the first place, right? You noted that we have already in the main human rights instruments protections that in theory apply to everyone. So thinking in particular about the right to participate in cultural life, cultural activity, sport, and leisure, we do have that reflected in the modern human rights framework. But of course, in practice, that framework didn't do a whole lot to protect the rights of persons with disabilities. So the CRPD drafting process was really a reform effort, right? It was an attempt at disrupting the received paradigm around disability and the deeply entrenched degree of social inclusion. And so it really set out to challenge the marginalization of disability manifest also in the human rights framework itself, right? So we were seeking to reform it. The origin of the treaty is one of the things that really stands out and that is quite different about this treaty. Its origin was really in the work of Mexico, not a government that was particularly known for its human rights activism or disability rights protection. But nonetheless, Mexico, way back in 2001, was very much trying to advance international agenda items. And having had a vice presidential or perhaps a presidential candidate who was a man with a disability from the civil society in Mexico, very, very active. He, together with Mexican government colleagues and President Fox, set about to disrupt the international human rights policy by saying and suggesting kind of radically in the South African conference on racism that there ought to be a committee set up to think about drafting a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. So it was the Conference Against Racism in South Africa in Durban that really was the genesis of this particular drafting process. Lots of people had thought about drafting a treaty, and certainly civil society, the disability movement had put forward and tried to advance reform efforts and efforts to draft a treaty, but it was really Mexico that was able to successfully initiate this process way back in 2001 through its really creative platform initially at the conference in South Africa, which it then took to the General Assembly in New York, introduced a resolution supporting the establishment of an ad hoc committee to look at proposals to consider drafting a convention. And then Mexico creatively used its embassies and diplomatic missions throughout the world to garner support for that process. At the time, I was working for a landmine survivors network in Washington, D.C., and we got a call from the Mexican government asking if they could come talk to us. And they wanted us to gather together members from the American disability community so that they could tell us about their treaty effort, and they wanted our support. So here you have a government without a very distinguished disability rights record, lobbying civil society to advance a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. That's not usually how a human rights treaty process starts. So that was incredibly unique and different. And then the community of people with disabilities from around the world started to get ourselves together as quickly as we possibly could to prepare for this totally unexpected treaty process. And we were not prepared. We had no idea what we were doing. But we quickly assembled and started to talk to other members of civil society who had been in the treaty drafting advocacy process at the UN and try to figure out what on earth we were going to do to help advance this effort. So it was a learning process. And really our first effort from the get-go was to try and ensure that the voice of people with disabilities, that disability rights organizations were front and center and in the leadership of the process. Not very easy given the UN headquarters in New York and around the world were not accessible. Not very easy because New York is an expensive place. So fundraising to make sure people could get to New York was a really big obstacle and hurdle. And then we had to fight throughout the process for the voice of people with disabilities to be heard. That was ongoing. But at the end, we had over 800 representatives of disabled people's organizations registered to participate in the ad hoc committee process. We started out with about 30 civil society representatives in a room and ended up with hundreds and hundreds. So it was an amazing process and definitely distinguished by the leadership of people with disabilities themselves in this process. I think I'll stop right now.
Thank you very much, Janet, for this insightful answer. I give the floor now to Monthian.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Janet, for taking initiative in referring to the story which all started by the Mexican government. I serve in the Advisory Committee on Disability to the Prime Minister of Thailand at that time. And we heard, of course, we have been following up on this issue, and upon acknowledgement of such proposal by the Mexican government, the Thai government appointed me to represent the negotiation team from Thailand. At the same time, UNSCAP organized a regional meeting to put together a draft, which was later on called a Bangkok draft. In June 2003, which was the first time I participated in the ad hoc committee on behalf of the Thai government. Of course, I came from civil society sector. We were still debating in the ad hoc committee whether we need a convention or a treaty. But finally, it was a resolution from that meeting that we will start the drafting process. And it was so fortunate that the chairperson at that time decided to adopt Bangkok draft as a chairman's draft. And we were all in New York in the snowy winter in January in the so-called drafting group, working group to draft. I spent a month in New York City at the time, mainly in the United Nations and also at the New Zealand embassy at nighttime, because we had to work until midnight. So it was interesting that because I've been working in the civil society sector for a long time. So even though I represent the Thai government, my table has always been jammed with representatives from civil society, DPOs and whatnot. So we are able to sneak in lots of proposals from civil society. I heard that it's so unprecedented that civil society organizations, especially organizations of persons with disabilities, are able to participate so actively in the UN process like that. So it's unprecedented compared to any negotiation process of any previous human rights treaty of its kind. It's also participated from around the world, driven by grassroots organization and multi-sectoral bodies. It was also for the first time that internet served as a very good mechanism to help rally opinions and comments to the work of the ad hoc committee. Even during the drafting time in January 2004, in January in the snowy, very icy and snowy winter, we keep interacting with people from all around the world. The drafting also went to the direction that this convention is supposed and ended up being a comprehensive, embracing both civil political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, or you can call it serves as both human rights treaty and a social development framework at the same time. So it's a hybrid convention. It also unprecedented included statistics in the human rights treaty for the first time, because many developing countries argue that without statistics of disability statistics, the budget negotiation could not be possible, especially poor countries. You know, they need number in order to argue for any initiatives and government policies that may have financial implication. It was for the first time that international cooperation was brought in to serve as a tool to help engaging developed and developing countries across the globe. So international cooperation that embraces both, you know, donors, recipients of development agencies, and technical, scientific cooperation, and you name it. It also, for the first time, that the Human Rights Treaty contained both national and international monitoring mechanism, recognizing the role of civil society organizations, especially organizations of persons with disabilities, in the process of implementation, evaluation, and monitoring of this Human Rights Treaty. So it was the first time of many kinds among human rights treaties. Of course, it was not allowed to introduce any new rights, but only to elaborate further existing human rights by adding or including disability perspective to make the human rights much richer and much more inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monthian, and thank you again, Janet, for your very insightful answers, for really highlighting what are the key features of the CRPD and of the drafting process. In particular, I note that you mentioned the unprecedented participation of TPOs and people with disabilities as a key tenet of the convention. I would like now to move to Article 30 now, more specifically. How did the idea for Article 30 come about? Which states or which civil society groups were actively advocating for this? I would like to start with Monthian and then Janet and Amy. Monthian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much again. I think Janet has already, and you probably, you mentioned quite a bit of how important the right to participate in cultural life, leisure, recreational and sporting activities. However, when it comes to disability perspective, most, if not all, governments cannot really understand and cannot really comprehend what on earth that prevent persons with disabilities from participating. They said everything is open to persons with disabilities. So the key issue is accessibility. Accessibility was in the general principles of the convention. It is also included in the general state obligations, and it was described in detail covering all aspects in Article 9, and also Article 21 on access to information and freedom of expression. But when it comes to culture itself, I think Article 30 is more like an everyday explanation of how accessibility really means and how it sets the tone, how it could serve as a backbone of the CRPD. Because without accessibility, the CRPD is not much different from previous treaties, human rights treaties. So accessibility really makes the human rights treaty more disability inclusive. So it's the accessibility, access to access. It means whether you're talking about enjoyment of cultural materials, access to cultural materials, you're talking about cultural activities and programs through the media, you're talking about cultural artistic sites or place of performance, you're talking about the enabling factor that allow persons with disabilities to develop and utilize their talent, their creativity, and their contribution. So also making sure that the international property rights law does not really limit access to cultural materials, recognizing the cultural identity and linguistic identity, including deaf culture and sign language, and also the measures to support the enjoyment of leisure, the recreational and sporting activities. So all of these were put in place, referring to existing human rights, but extending it to cover how persons with disabilities can enjoy all of that. And I think the key issue is accessibility, which plays very important role, as I said. As far as I know, there are two distinct organizations of persons with disabilities that lobby vigorously on two issues. There are different issues, but they are not conflicting. The World Blind Union negotiated a lot on the international intellectual property rights law that may hindrance or may cause barrier to access to cultural materials. I also proposed a very strong text at the time. The World Federation of the Deaf also lobbied very hard on the issue of deaf culture and sign language. So accessibility in other aspects, I think we all share our common need, and also work collaboratively during the negotiation process. Sporting events, of course, and access to monumental and touristic sites. All of these were put together as the content appear for the most part.
Thank you very much, Monthian. I now give the floor to Janet.
Thank you. And I'm so glad, Monthian, that you reminded us of some of the key organizations who were involved in that particular article. So I'll focus a little bit on the origin more from the government side. You know, what were we seeing in terms of those early drafts, and what governments were involved in supporting or forwarding that that particular, what became Article 30. So I did go back to the Mexican draft. That was the first proposal that was tabled at the ad hoc committee, the first one. And there were all sorts of interesting features in that Mexican draft. And I went back and I did discover that, in fact, in Article 16, there was indeed an article that very, very roughly reflects what we have now in the treaty in Article 30. So in the Mexico draft was quite a short article, and I'll read it because it's interesting. States parties shall ensure that persons with disabilities have access to and the enjoyment of, and it lists 3 areas. Number 1, recreational, cultural, and sports activities through adaptations which facilitate them the use of related facilities and services. Second, their integration into routine sports activities and national as well as international competitions. And then finally, a system of scholarships or special incentives for cultural, artistic, and sports activities. So if we turn then to what ultimately became the adopted text for Article 30, we see lots of changes, lots of differences, new concepts, and whole new issues being inserted into that text. But its origin, we might say was to some extent the Mexican draft. And certainly, as has been pointed out, its origin is in some of the other international human rights instruments that already cover access to and the right to participate in cultural activities, as well as the social right to participate in sport and recreation and leisure activities, as well as the right to play, which we see reflected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I imagine that Amy is going to take us into that element in some depth. So the Mexican draft was a jumping off point for governments to look at that into greater detail. And then we fast forward to the working group that Monthian has already referenced, and that winter in New York, where we were spending many long hours, not only at the UN, but as Monthian mentioned, heading back over after hours to the New Zealand mission and sitting in their conference room until sometimes very, very late at night. So we did already in that working group draft that consisted of only 25 provisions. We now have 50 in our convention, but already in the first 25 provisions of that working group draft, we do have a provision on participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure, and sport. At the time, that was draft Article 24. As you know, it is now the last in the specific substantive articles in the treaty. It's draft 30. So it kind of rounds things out very nicely with a really strong theme of accessibility wedded throughout that. So we had in the working group text that much more elaborated draft than what we saw in the Mexican proposal, amplified in part, as Monthian said, by the contributions of civil society organizations, the World Blind Union, the World Federation of the Deaf, and other organizations pressing for a more elaborated text that really took into account not only access to culture and cultural life on an equal basis, but an appreciation of the cultural participation among persons with disabilities that enriches everyone's life, right? So it became a much more elaborated provision that also addressed linguistic identity, linguistic rights, as well as intellectual property rights, and a much more elaborated approach to participating in sport and recreation as well. Kind of grew from that. And the other thing I would note is that the states took very much as a jumping off point the UN standard rules on the equalization of opportunities of persons with disabilities. So already there in the standard rules in articles, I believe 10, 9 and 10 and 11 had rather elaborate provisions that address these kinds of issues. So that's an interesting example of how the standard rules did play a really important role in the crafting of some of the articles of the convention. And I would say this is one in particular where the standard rules played a really important role. And it's interesting to note what we got was a composite article with lots of different elements in it. At one point during the negotiations, there was a suggestion that we divide up these different issue areas into separate provisions. That did not happen. So we stuck with a very interesting article that has many different elements in it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janet, for this very, very interesting overview of the process of the drafting of this article. I would like now to give the floor to Emmy for some more reflections on how did the idea for Article 30 come about.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Monthian and Janet, for going into really great detail on how it came about. And I particularly love Janet's final comment about how there was at a point a real discussion about separating or dividing some of this content up, and we ended up with something that's beautifully diverse and complex at the same time. But most of my comments today, what I'll bring to the table is mostly around Article 30.5. So it's around sport, recreation, play, and leisure. And that's because that's an area that I've been focused on. And just to note that I'll probably use the word sport today to mostly encompass all aspects. So I won't give you all of the different components each time I mention it. But following on what they said, the idea that, from my perspective, the idea for this article was really based on the prevailing discrimination, inequality, and exclusion that persons with disabilities were facing. And are still facing in this area, particularly around sport. There was a tendency that we needed to clarify really what kinds of access they needed and had the right to have. And there was a prevailing tendency for sport to be segregated and linked to rehabilitation. And in the with the ideas of the convention coming forward about inclusion and participation, it was really important that sport was also one of those areas that was highlighted. You know, at the time, there weren't many parks and playgrounds and trails that were accessible. There wasn't a lot of resources, even today, being put towards this area, and I'll get to that later. But I think it's important, before I get into sort of who was present and why, I think it's also important just to highlight that this article, and I'm sure people will have the chance to read it in detail, but it really calls for the promotion of participation in sport and the quality of participation. So it's not just a non-discrimination mandate, but it also calls on member states to take the appropriate measures to ensure that full and equal participation and promotion of access. And I say this because it gets into a lot of detail in the article. And I think that was the detail that state parties were missing at the time. They didn't understand that people with disabilities had multiple roles in sport, that they could be anything from a spectator to a fan, to an athlete, to a coach, to an administrator, you know, to a decision maker. So there's a lot of nuances within this article. And that was part of, you know, I wouldn't say the impetus was the sheer discrimination that was happening in the inequality. But then once we got into it, we realized there was a lot of complexity and things that we wanted to clarify. So it was really about ensuring that equality of opportunity. And so just to bring it back to, you know, I worked for the International Paralympic Committee at the time at headquarters. And we decided to engage in the process on behalf of civil society, representing thousands of Paralympic athletes and the whole movement, because we wanted to ensure that the full spectrum of opportunities was being captured. You know, we're known, the Paralympics are known for being an elite level sporting competition, but the reality is all athletes start at a grassroots level, and they need the means and the support and the opportunities to do that. And so the IPC came in with the idea that we want to ensure that sport is there. We want to ensure that grassroots is there. And we want to ensure that that people with disabilities have the opportunity to choose the approach that they wish to take to participate. And I mean, this is because people with disabilities have the right to access all the health benefits, all the societal benefits that sport can bring. And so, you know, sport can do a lot in changing perceptions and societal norms, but it also is about that pure access point. So we were not the ones, we'll get to this later, we were not the ones advocating for disability specific terminology. That was not the International Paralympic Committee. What we were advocating for was to ensure that people had the choice and that we would value that there was value actually in having that option to choose a disability specific one. So I worked very closely with Janet and Landmine Survivors Network on this article, and two other advocates that were really worth noting are Elise Roy and Eli Wolf. And what we did is made sure that what we were advocating for was grounded in reality, and that we came together as a community and with OPDs, or organizations of persons with disabilities. So I'm going to stop there and get into more on the content later.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to all our speakers for such an insightful overview of the idea of Article 30 and of the drafting process of this particular provision. Building on the answers that you already gave, I would like to ask you, what were the key issues during the debate on Article 30? You already touched upon a few of them, but if you could elaborate a bit more and really highlight why the final text was different from previous drafts, I would ask Janet to start.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I will touch on a few of the issues, a few of the points. As I said, that we already in the working group draft had a draft article. So it was not one of those articles that was added late in the day after the working group. And we already had the jumping off point of not only the Mexico draft, but the standard rules. So the draft really at the time of the working group reflected very much the UN standard rules. And there was a lot of support from delegations as well as civil society for this particular provision and for it to remain in the working group text. So it was not actually a hot button article. There were some other articles in the draft that were quite contentious. I would say this was not one of them. But as Amy has emphasized, it's a very complex text. There's a lot of different issue areas that are covered in Article 30. So one of the pain points or the points of contention was, have we structured this article in the best way? Does it make the most sense to put all of these different issues that relate to culture, linguistic identity, so right to culture on the one hand, the right to participate in cultural activities as a sort of separate bundle with the theme of accessibility, as Monthian has mentioned, and then even moving beyond that to reflecting on intellectual property law, which is this whole subject area in international law itself, and the provision that we have on applying the treaty in a way that is, or let's say applying intellectual property law in a way that's consistent with the principles of the treaty, and then moving on to all of the provisions on sport, recreation, play, leisure. So there was a lot to put in there, and there were a number of delegations as well as civil society organizations, as Amy said, who thought it might be better to parse these out into separate articles. So the structure was one of the issues that was discussed very much in the context of the negotiations. And then a few other points that I would add that are kind of interesting. So, for example, New Zealand was very much in favor of this provision. They emphasized during the negotiations that the article ought to include not only access to cultural material, but cultural activities. And that was reflected in in the later text, post-working group text. A couple of other issues that came up in the negotiations was the point that it's probably important to include in the provision specific instances of accessibility to cultural performances and services. So in the drafting of a treaty, it's always that balancing act. Do you want to be really specific and list things out and risk excluding other things? But it was felt that it was really important to give a non-exhaustive listing of categories of activities that represent major vehicles of cultural forms that are so often inaccessible to people with disabilities. Because remember that this treaty is very much a tool for education, right, for states and for others, so that it's possible to understand and identify the different types of barriers that persons with disabilities experience, so that states actually understand what it is, what those barriers are, and then how to go about actually dismantling them. And so it took a similar approach as the standard rules in actually giving some specific examples. A couple of other points to highlight. During the negotiations, there was an attempt to introduce language that referenced women and refugees on account of their dual minority status. So Namibia had thought that it would be important in the context of the sport and recreation components to call out women with disabilities and refugees with disabilities. That didn't happen, but remember this treaty, one of the things that makes it so interesting is that we have to read it transversely. So we go back to the specific provision on women and read that into this particular article. So that didn't make its way in, which is kind of interesting. And then the final point I would make is that initially as drafted in the working group, the article talking about linguistic identity, cultural and linguistic rights referred specifically to deaf persons only. But the point was made that it needs to apply equally to all people with disabilities. And although deaf and deafblind persons are called out in that context, it in fact relates to the cultural and linguistic rights of all persons with disabilities, which is quite interesting. And then finally, a point to note that initially in the working group draft, we did not have the reference to the right to play. That was added later. So the negotiations, I think, really enriched the working group draft in some really important and significant ways.
Thank you very much, Janet. That was very informative and very insightful. Monthian, what would you like to add about the key issues related to the debates surrounding Article 30?
Thank you very much. I think I will spend less time on this question, but I will probably do more on the last question. However, I'd like to point out specific parts within Article 30 that were a bit contagious and call for lots of debate. I think in paragraph 1C, it was a bit difficult to put forward the suggestion to add enjoyment of monument and sites of national cultural importance, because you probably know that many old places requiring accessibility would mean modification of museums and archaeological sites. I might be wrong in terms of English. Anyhow, so several people were not comfortable with that, but finally we were able to put to the extent possible. So it means that to the extent that it would not be in conflict with how we preserve old places, old cultural heritage, from being too modified to satisfy our accessibility requirement. Of course, we would like to push to the limit. So that's one of the most difficult part. And the second one is about intellectual property law. For example, I myself would like to eliminate any restriction from international intellectual property rights law from causing barrier of access to cultural materials. I was a bit too extreme in the eyes and the ears of several colleagues, and it was suggested that we should insert in accordance with international law, which means that no matter what you do, you have to act within the framework, within the norms of international law, rather than seeking to eliminate all provision of international law which restrict access to cultural materials. It took quite a bit of time for me to come to a compromise solution. So I was fighting quite stubbornly on this. I remember quite well. I think paragraph 4, as Janet mentioned already, but I think we get a very good compromise, even though we intend finally to make it comprehensively inclusive of all persons with disabilities, regardless of impairment types and severity of impairment. Recognition of deaf culture and sign language is important, and it will not rule, it will not damage the recognition of cultural identities and linguistic minorities of all other people with disabilities, but to emphasize something that is lacking, something that has never been, that has been barely recognized. And we got disrupted by several government officials. Fortunately, not Thailand, because I was a leader in the group, but many state parties couldn't understand how sign language could be a language, and they couldn't understand how deaf culture would be regarded as deaf culture. So it took quite several days to get a very nicely written text that reflect how we can compromise to achieve this. It's not perfect, but I think it's a good compromise. And the last paragraph, I think until now, and I will talk more about this in the final question, I think even among disability communities, we are still competing whether we should focus on mainstream inclusive sporting activities or we should focus on disability specific sporting activities. So I think it's still a parallel process. The state parties, many governments would like us to choose one way or another, but it cannot be so. It could not be so. It's the reality that we need to have both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monthian, also for highlighting this tension between intellectual property law and the UNCRPD that has been solved somewhat, or as you said, a compromise was reached in Article 30. I want to now move to the final question of this debate, which looks forward. What do you think are the biggest challenges in implementing Article 30 at the grassroots level in state parties? So we have looked at the drafting process, at what are the ideas that prompted the adoption of Article 30. And now we want to look at the future, at the implementation of these provision. I would like to ask Amy to start.
Thank you for that. So without sounding too, I mean, the implementation is exciting, it's happening, and it's definitely an evolving process. I'd like to just point out one of the tensions that exists, and that is that there is a tendency that still remains and was there when we were drafting the convention, or part of that, that some rights are not equal to other rights. And you see this tendency coming up that there's a hierarchy, and we know that's not the case. But typically, the area I work in with around sport is coming up as a secondary or even further down the line as a priority. The CRPD has done a lot to change this and to put it on the agenda. But what we find at the grassroots level, particularly in around implementation, is that there's still challenges in terms of discussing and realizing the right. This could be in terms of allocation of resources. It could be in terms of staffing, in terms of programming or facilities being accessible. You know, that there is unfortunately, more needs to be done to raise the importance of this issue and the right. So it can also be more, in my work, I look a lot at the violations of the right as well. And to get remedy around Article 30 can be very challenging. Again, to get decision makers and their attention, and to make sure that we have the structures in place to handle when there are violations. I also think when you combine that with the existing and prevailing negative stigma and discrimination that is still in some of these communities at the grassroots level, it can really exacerbate what we're trying to combat. But there are pockets of good work being done. There are strong individuals at the grassroots and community level and other levels. So it's just a balance between us still trying to get state parties to acknowledge. I mean, there's very little reporting done on Article 30.5 when state parties report to the committee. So there are needs for more attention and clarification. You know, a general comment on this article that would look at the nuances that Monthian brought up between this parallel importance of disability specific and mainstream, and what that text means when it says to the fullest extent possible. I mean, there's so many nuances in this text, particularly in 30.5. And I also think that we need to empower and educate people with disabilities about this right, because when I speak to people in the community all around the world, they don't know they have the right to sport. And so particularly as we leave urban centers, and that's something that organizations of persons with disabilities are addressing, but they too have to prioritize their resources. And so if it's not somebody's personal interest, sometimes it doesn't get on the agenda. And I just want to end and say that finally, this is actually a really exciting time for sport, because the worlds of sport and human rights are coming together very strongly at the moment. And what's happening is that the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, just released a report in March. It was presented to the Human Rights Council, and they had a debate or a discussion around it. And it was very specifically looking at 30.5. And this report does a really good job at telling us where we are today in terms of this article. And I just want to mention there is a podcast out from the Center for Sport and Human Rights that had a discussion with some of the key players in 30.5 on the report and on where we're at today. So I think that podcast could also be a nice supplement to the discussion we're having today, because I haven't been able to go into the details of really what the article says as much as we may need to, but I know that there's more on the summer school on this. So I'll conclude there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was very insightful, and I know you couldn't go into much detail as much as you wanted, probably because we have an agenda schedule, but that was extremely important and insightful. And I think that you also really highlighted the need to shed a light on Article 30 in all its components. And personally, I think that participation in culture, in leisure, and in sport is important to affirm personhood, free expression of the self. So to me, this is linked really to the identity of people and to personhood. And so that's why we should really contribute to make Article 30 and the implementation of this provision a priority. I want to hand over now to Monthian and then to Janet for their observations and remarks on the implementation of this provision. Monthian.
Thank you very much. I would like to bring in a few points. First of all, our Article 30 is mainly regarded as the article on economic, social, and cultural rights, which are subject to progressive realization. So several states parties do not interpret this as an urgent matter. So therefore, many countries may not even give priorities. Of course, they can come up with a very good sound bites, but when it comes to real actual implementation, Article 30, as you may notice, does not contain any word like non-discrimination, prohibit any form of discrimination. So it does not have a text which prohibit violation. And the substance of the article is mainly on social, economic, cultural rights. So it has a lot of financial implication to many states parties. Accessibility is another issue which governs this article. Accessibility does not enjoy the status of rights. Even though we wanted it originally, we would like to push accessibility as a new right, but it was opposed by several states parties. So accessibility only enjoy the level of general principles included in the state obligation and serve only as a tool or mechanism to ensure enjoyment of other rights from the disability perspective. So it means that the implementation of anything concerning accessibility is going to be negotiable. It's going to be negotiated through lack of funding, lack of an understanding of accessibility standards, experts, all kinds of things like that. So it sort of undermined the urgency and the importance of such mechanism to really ensure enjoyment of full human rights. And paragraph 3, which enjoy international, I would say, beginning of the dawn of victory. You probably know that after the CRPD came into being, we went on and pushed for the Marrakesh Treaty, which came into being in 2013. The Marrakesh Treaty could only achieve reading material, not the whole array of cultural materials. And it is so limited in many cases that that compromise the final goal as set in Article 30, paragraph 3. Nevertheless, it's monumental. We can claim that we've got some victory in terms of implementation, but in order to implement the Marrakesh Treaty, which is a tiny part of Article 30, paragraph 3, you need to promulgate changes to copyright law in the domestic, domestic law, copyright law, which is not that easy because copyright laws are mainly a mainstream law. It is not disability specific law. So in order to make revision or amendment to copyright law in general, you are going to have to work with lots of communities, and compromise the copyright law mean you may end up watering down the purpose of this convention. But nevertheless, the life goes on. We've been fighting on that. Again, I'd like to remind you that for several state parties, recognition of cultural identities and linguistic identities could not be could not be understandable when it comes to disability perspective. Many people do not regard sign language as languages. They do not regard deaf culture as a culture. So it will take years and years to really push for true implementation, especially most countries do not implement the convention directly. They need to legislate domestic law. They need to have domestic legislation to implement. The same way as in case of Article 30, paragraph 3. When it comes to sport, I think I may end up repeating my previous comment that up to now we still have so little access to mainstream sporting activities. What Amy just mentioned is also very crucial, that if you cannot ensure full accessibility of the sport and recreational facilities, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to really dream of persons with disabilities fully participating in inclusive or mainstream sporting activities. So it's a long process, and it's only it works in theory. And when we're talking about Paralympics or Special Olympics, they could not even organize these activities at the same time or in parallel. They need to do it sequentially, because they don't know how to organize inclusive sporting activities. And it would be probably mostly unheard of to have persons with disabilities participating side by side in the same sporting activities as non-disabled people if basic requirements of accessibility and inclusion could not be well addressed and taken care of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monthian. And now I give the floor to Janet for the very final reflections on the challenges in implementing Article 30.
Thanks, Delia. And I think I accidentally had turned my video off for a few minutes. Sorry about that. But thank you for that question. And I think, one of the abiding themes of this panel is that these rights that we're talking about are not as well developed as other human rights, and they're often forgotten. And we know that people with disabilities have more often than not, been left out of the wide array of cultural opportunities that other people in society, take for granted. And human rights practice has largely neglected the cultural rights as well as other rights of persons with disabilities. So I think what this social rights advocacy requires is complicated. It's multifaceted. It is not something that will be addressable simply through legislation, because we're talking about undoing social scripts around disability. But the vehicle of cultural activities and expression, participation in sport, and so on, is absolutely vital for the project of visibility that is the treaty, right? So I think in many ways, this particular provision connects back to all of the other provisions in the treaty, and it's just incredibly important. So thinking about how social rights advocacy really requires strategic action by local groups on a number of different fronts is something that's really important. And I think it's also really challenging because we are required as disability rights activists to move beyond legislation and figure out how we can change social norms around disability. And first and foremost, that means getting people out into society, people with disabilities interacting, whether at a museum, whether being on stage, playing a game and not being relegated to the sidelines. So that's kind of the ongoing challenge. And so while Article 30, it doesn't address head on some of the tensions that we see being played out, notions of disability inclusive versus separate performances, for example, in theater or dance or music, or ongoing debates, for example, in film around the appropriateness or otherwise of non-disabled actors portraying disabled persons. I mean, there's lots of interesting questions that have been brought to the fore through disability studies lenses that are not addressed really by Article 30. The provision focuses really on the middle ground, right? It focuses on outlining the duty of states to take measures to support access to places where cultural performances or sporting activities or services are held. And it includes, as far as possible, more contingently, the right of people with disabilities to access monuments and sites of national cultural importance. So it's trying to achieve a lot in ensuring that people with disabilities are full participants in the cultural life of their communities as not only spectators, but as athletes, as musicians, artists, scholars, and actors. And so I think it's a very complicated social rights advocacy that we are asked to practice in order to forward momentum on Article 30, because we're really trying to confront received cultural narratives about disability and to make visible alternative social scripts. And that requires harnessing Article 8 on awareness raising in the convention. It means making sure that in Article 24 implementation around education, that kids with disabilities are participating in recreation and sport. It is, linked to all of the other provisions in the treaty. But we have seen some really interesting advocacy action take place across the world. We see advocacy to disrupt these kinds of narratives in December 3rd, the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. In many instances, you see community cultural events being deployed by DPOs or organizations of people with disabilities to raise the image and voice of people with disabilities in sport, in artistic activities. There's been some pretty creative expressions that I think are very easy to do and doesn't take a lot of complex, legislative advocacy that many local disability rights organizations might not be able to implement effectively. So I'll give a couple of examples of, I think, really unique things that have been done. One is a really interesting display that I saw in Cairo on the walls of the Swiss embassy, where some very well-known photographers took photographs of deaf Egyptians using sign language. And they put monumental scale images on the wall of the embassy complex in downtown Cairo, along with an informational poster about Egyptian Sign Language and a glossary of Egyptian Sign Language. That was incredibly powerful in raising the visibility of deaf Egyptians with disabilities. Other really interesting examples are to look at social rights advocacy trying to address disability in popular culture. So looking at the cultural phenomena of comic books and graphic novels and things like that, displacing received representations with alternatives that reflect disability inclusive imagery is, I think, really cool stuff that local advocacy groups are doing in many instances all around the world. Looking at the work that theater companies have been doing to problematize and confront an audience with sometimes really uncomfortable images and juxtapositions of stereotypical ideas about disability, and trying to confront an audience with things that with their own biases and their own stigma, which I think is really interesting and really important. And we've seen at the kind of other end of the continuum of implementation, you know, a lot of efforts to just get in the door in the first place, right? So sometimes it's looking at constructing a locally sourced ramp, right, to accommodate people with disabilities to local theaters or to local museums or local sporting facilities. And that is still something that needs to happen in a lot of places. And very often we have to still fight against the impulse to construct something separate, right? So my colleagues were trying to, in Jordan, trying to say, you know what, we don't want a separate pool built for people with disabilities. We just want to be able to get into the same pool. So there's a lot of really cool things being done to disrupt these you know, traditional paradigms around disability that this treaty is really all about. And I hope through this summer school, we're going to elevate and amplify Article 30 as a really important dimension of this exciting treaty.
Thank you very much, Janet. And it's also my hope that Article 30 will become a key feature also for state parties when they implement the convention. Then they have to realize the paradigm shift. We are approaching actually the conclusion of this very informative and insightful debate. I want to thank all the speakers. They've been absolutely amazing, and they have given so much information and so many insights into the drafting process, but also into the challenges and the tensions that emerge from the text of Article 30. I would like to ask to every one of you whether you want to add a final statement or a final phrase before we officially close this session. Amy, I would start from you, perhaps.
Could I have a few words?
Monthian, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Please.
Yeah. Thank you. I think Janet has reminded me that we have seen the practical implementation of Article 30, perhaps intentionally or unintentionally, but I think we can use a symbolic example of several activities being implemented around the world. We've seen more so than ever audio description and also captioning in all sorts of television programs or even seminars, or it has become part of the mainstream culture now, and we have seen the theater or the performance center, art performance center, being recognized the importance of how it needs to be more accessible. We see, so Article 30 is really a more tangible, concrete implementation of Article 9 and Article 21, because it talks about everyday life, whereas Article 9 and 21 tends to go into more like a substance of the rights and with regards to accessibility, whereas Article 30 talks more about how we perceive our way of life, how we go about in our daily activities. So I think by trying to call attention through whether it's through legislation, administration, and all non-government private sector issues. I think the Article 30 is not perceived as a demand, as a mandate, as much of a mandate, as it only reflects cultural, economic, social rights, but perhaps its flexibility and its down-to-earth everyday life, nature, we may be able to see more willingness of the society to follow the spirit and the purpose of Article 30 much more easily than the much stronger article, for example, Article 9 and 21 or even 24. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for having me join this discussion and for being, it was a pleasure to be with Monthian, Janet, and yourself, Delia, because these are really important conversations to have. I'm thrilled that the summer school is looking at this article. I do think now is the right time and an exciting time. And I just want to say thank you for letting me be a part of this today.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to have you here today. Janet.
Thank you. Well, I too want to thank everyone, and it's wonderful that this last of the specific substantive articles in the convention is getting a front and center play in the summer school. And I guess my final word on Article 30 is that it is it really supports advocacy on many different fronts, right? Community, national, and international. And I think it reminds us of the complexity of social rights advocacy, right? That, you know, strategic litigation or legislative advocacy to undercut stereotyping and or documentation of human rights violations, those are all really important ingredients in working transformative change. But that's not going to suffice, right? To see the right to participate in cultural life and sport realized in any meaningful and transformative way, right? That's not going to remediate social scripts of normalcy, right? That we are trying to combat. And so I think Article 30, when we think about it, is it suggests that we really need to engage in a more complex reading and advocacy around the CRPD and think about the culturally transformative practices that will really confront the oppressive structures that we're facing and that stand in the way of full and comprehensive CRPD implementation. So I think that the CRPD really does provide us with a template for enfranchising people with disabilities in culture and cultural life. And I think it presses us and challenges us to respond with a social rights advocacy that claims access to cultural institutions and cultural spaces and public spaces, and that we really need to remember that the CRPD, in its very comprehensive approach to advocacy, challenges us to really destabilize and restructure cultural expression and participation with all of the principles in the treaty: autonomy and inclusion and freedom of choice and respect for difference and non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation and universal design. So for me, it's a really challenging but really interesting article, and it's been great to have the opportunity to reflect again on that and the negotiations around Article 30, which were very rich. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this closing statement. I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers, Monthian, Buntan, Janet Lord, Amy Farkas, Georgios. I hope the pronunciation wasn't that bad. Thank you very much for your amazing contribution. I want to thank also the organizers of the summer school, and in particular Professor Flynn, for having me and us today. And I hope the participants will enjoy this debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.